de l'Université de Montréal. Alors aujourd'hui, il me fait grand plaisir d'accueillir Jura Augustinavicius qui possède, excusez-moi, qui possède un doctorat en santé publique et une formation en épidémiologie psychiatrique. Elle s'intéresse plus particulièrement à la santé mentale mondiale. Jura est professeur à l'École de santé mondiale à McGill. Sa recherche se concentre essentiellement, ou ses recherches plutôt, sur les liens entre santé mentale et notamment le changement ou les changements climatiques, ou encore en contexte d'intervention humanitaire auprès des réfugiés. Jusqu'à présent, elle a contribué à étudier les impacts, donc en termes de changement climatique, les impacts des feux de forêt sur la santé mentale des habitants en Alaska. Actuellement, elle est impliquée dans plusieurs autres projets dont l'objectif vise à comprendre les liens entre changement climatique, conflits et santé mentale au Mali. Une autre étude cherche à examiner un modèle d'intervention de soutien en santé mentale psychosociale pour les réfugiés sud-soudanais en Ouganda. Et là, j'en profite pour rappeler que le conflit et les violences dans le Sud-Soudan, donc au Darfour, ont repris de plus belle. Et s'il est important de parler de la guerre en Ukraine et de ses effets sur les populations, il ne faut pas oublier qu'il y a d'autres conflits, et notamment au Sud-Soudan. Alors, Jura a notamment contribué à des articles sur la manière dont la dépression est vécue dans le monde, sur les interventions vis-à-vis de la détresse psychologique des femmes soudanaises réfugiées en Ouganda, ou encore sur les liens entre qualité du sommeil et les conditions de vie en milieu de pauvreté urbaine en Argentine, l'étude de la pauvreté qui devrait continuer effectivement en santé publique à faire l'objet de notre attention. So welcome, Jura, and we are ready to listen to your presentation that is entitled Supporting Mental Health and Psychosocial Wellbeing in the Context of the Climate Crisis. Welcome, Jura.
Merci beaucoup, Patrick, et bienvenue tout le monde. Je vais donner mon présentation en anglais, je m'excuse, mais avec subtitles. Alors, j'espère que ça peut aider un peu. C'est mon premier essai avec les subtitles dans PowerPoint. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a little bit about my research program, just to give you a sense. Patrick actually gave a great introduction, so I could almost skip that, but I think it will help. And then I'll provide a bit of background information on climate change and mental health, just because I think that sometimes making that link is a little bit hard for people, even those who work specifically within climate change or specifically within mental health. So I'll try to convince you of the links between the two and the need for research in this area. And then I'm going to just provide a little bit of a description of one study today. And this is a Delphi study that's focused on mental health and psychosocial support and climate crisis research priorities. And so it's a little bit of a different study, but I thought it would be interesting to highlight some priorities that are emerging for this area. And this is something that will be published in the next month in the Intervention Journal. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have time for some questions and discussion. So my research program is focused on research to support the implementation and evaluation of interventions predominantly. And many of the same methods can be used in intervention research to address mental health problems and promote well-being in both humanitarian settings and among populations who are most impacted by climate change. And the process I use is kind of shown here at the bottom of the slide. So first, developing a culturally and contextually informed understanding of mental health and psychosocial constructs and their determinants. And then reliably and validly identifying indicators of those constructs and measuring those. So sometimes adapting or developing new measurement instruments to actually look at those constructs. And this is really important because the kinds of mental health constructs and the way that they're described really differ by context and culture. And we see this in climate change as well, in terms of some new emerging constructs that are coming out, like climate change anxiety, for example, or solastalgia. We then use this information to identify, adapt, and pilot interventions. And typically I've worked, of course, with mental health and psychosocial support interventions, and then monitoring and evaluating interventions against the indicators that I described. If the interventions prove to be effective, the last step is, of course, to examine implementation factors that might enhance or hinder their sustainability or scalability. So, my work, and I'm sure many of your work as well, falls along this process somewhere. So I'll now move to some background on climate change and mental health. I'm sure most of you know already that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, is the United Nations body that's responsible for assessing the science related to climate change. And in a special report that they issued in 2018, the IPCC estimated with high confidence that human activities have already caused global warming of 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and that warming is likely to reach, and actually may already have reached, 1.5 degrees Celsius if it remains unchanged. They also stated that risks in a number of key areas, so things like health, livelihoods, food and water availability, conflict, all of which are directly and indirectly related to mental health and psychosocial well-being, are expected to rise with climate change. And they're going to continue to rise and keep rising as we surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius. The recently released IPCC's sixth assessment report at the end of 2021 stated that global surface temperature will continue to increase until at least the mid-century under all emission scenarios that they looked at. And global warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during this century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. So I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone, but this is really a race against time that we are losing due to inaction. And as we all know, the climatic changes that are being experienced are stressing all of the Earth's systems and everything that depends on them, including our human life. And these changes amplify existing risks, and they create new risks for human systems, but also for other ecological systems. And the risks are not evenly distributed. And this is really what we see in these figures that show country-level economic responses to global warming. So what we see here is that the gap between richer countries that are predominantly in the global north and poorer countries predominantly in the global south is growing with global warming. And of course, we know that there are inequalities within countries. So for example, here in Canada, warming is occurring at twice the rate of the global average, but in general across the country, but 3 times the rate of the global average in the north of the country specifically, which of course is disproportionately impacting rural and indigenous populations that live in the north. And when it comes to health and social outcomes, people that are living in the most climate vulnerable contexts are generally experiencing the worst outcomes. And these impacts are being experienced over the life course. And so there's great concern, understandably, for children and youth who are just starting their lives at this very difficult time in our human history. The 2019 Lancet Countdown report, for example, emphasized that a child born in that year would witness impacts on human health and their health from birth through older adulthood, so over their whole life course. And a decade earlier, the first Lancet Commission had already stated that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And so how does this really relate to humanitarian needs and humanitarian crises? As Patrick mentioned, this is an area that I'm very interested in and populations that I work with a fair bit in my research. So humanitarian crises are characterized by the need for external assistance, and they can include complex emergencies that are driven by disasters caused by natural hazards, armed conflict, and technological disasters. OCHA is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and they estimated that 1 in 33 people worldwide would need humanitarian assistance and protection in 2021, so 1 in 33. That represented already an increase from 1 in 45 in 2020, when you can see humanitarian needs were already the highest that they had been in decades. And climate change is driving specific humanitarian needs and some of these increases. So in fact, the 2020 Global Humanitarian Overview by OCHA listed climate change as an emerging trend and risk. And some specific contributors to humanitarian needs from the climate change side include increases in global hunger and severe food crises, water shortages, increased violence, including conflict between populations, but also gender-based and familial violence and displacement, among others. And so these are really key ways that climate change is impacting and propagating humanitarian needs, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. In 2021, OCHA named climate change, along with conflict and COVID-19, as the primary drivers of humanitarian needs. And the UN Secretary General called this the greatest humanitarian challenge since the Second World War. So these are quite difficult times globally. And so what role does mental health play in all of this? And I just want to provide a brief picture of the climate change and mental health literature, which is really growing, and I'll show that in a second. There's a base of both quantitative and qualitative research within climate change and mental health, and there has been a recent surge in reviews and commentaries calling for more empirical evidence in this area. I was fortunate to be involved in a recent scoping review with Fiona Charlson and colleagues to examine the climate change and mental health literature. And that's where this figure comes from here. So compared with other reviews of this literature, our review used more specific terms related to climate change. And so we ended up with a narrower set of included articles than some of the other reviews that have been published. And we found that most original research studies in this area were actually conducted in high-income countries. So more than 3/4 of the studies done on climate change and mental health were done in high-income countries, with only 3% from low-income countries as per World Bank classifications. And so that's what's shown in this figure. And what this really says is that there's this, or underscores is the huge inequity in this area, where the research being done is not being done necessarily by people who are actually living in the most climate change affected contexts. And that's something that really needs to change, and hopefully that we're starting to address in some of the work that we're doing, like the priority study. I will say, just for interest, that the largest share of studies were conducted in Australia, Canada, and the US. And this figure shows the number of studies published on climate change and mental health between 2007 and 2020. There were actually not studies identified by the review before 2007. So that should tell you how kind of recent and exponential the growth in this area has been. Among the 120 studies included in the review, more than half use quantitative methods, about a third use qualitative methods, and a sixth use mixed methods. So most of those studies were using quantitative methods. I just want to emphasize, though, that there's an 8-fold increase here between 2007 and 2020. So just a really rapid rise in the literature. And so what are these studies looking at? Well, the majority of studies relevant to climate change and mental health come from the disaster mental health literature, which has been around for a long time. And they've really focused on what we call acute exposures that are increasing in frequency and intensity as a result of climate change. So these include things like tropical cyclones, floods, wildfires, extreme heat. And they have diverse impacts on mental health, morbidity and mortality, and impacts on well-being. So these exposures have been linked to things like higher levels of mental health symptoms, disorders, suicides, and mental health related hospital admissions, as well as a number of impacts on well-being, both at the individual and community level. And I just want to emphasize, that it's really important not to pathologize either in the context of climate change or in the context of humanitarian conditions, what really are normal psychological reactions to adversity. So surviving one of these things undoubtedly will have impacts on people and communities. And we need to be careful not to assume that that people will go on to develop problems that require advanced levels of care. And some may, and that's fine, and that needs to be addressed. But this is something that I just wanted to kind of put a disclaimer in for here. While there are no real concrete estimates of the burden of mental health problems associated with climate change, we do have a sense of the burden associated with specific acute exposures from that disaster mental health literature, and in relation to extreme weather events in particular. But you can see that the ranges in prevalence are massive. And so it's quite hard to come up with any kind of a summary statement on this. And of course, this has to do with a number of different things, and probably stemming back to how we conceptualize mental and prioritize mental health problems, measurement error, and so on and so forth. There are a number of predictors, though, of adverse outcomes that have been described in the literature. So things like gender, socioeconomic disadvantage, the degree of exposure to an actual disaster, extreme weather event, and the extent to which someone has psychosocial resources to cope with what's been going on. And I, again, just want to emphasize that gosh, I can't say that word today. I just want to emphasize that these outcomes are not necessarily the only ones that matter. They're just the ones that have been most studied. A smaller body of research has also shown how more chronic or slow creeping climate change related disruptions to landscapes and places are associated with mental health impacts. And so these types of climate change exposures, like rising sea levels, melting sea ice, melting permafrost, gradual rises in temperatures, if you want to call them gradual, depending on your time scale, these types of things can impact a sense of place and identity, and they can lead to a range of emotional responses as shown in literature, things like anxiety, grief, anger, helplessness, depression, among others. And there's actually this whole emerging literature on the science of loss, with reports of ecological grief and disruptions to connections to land, culture, relationships, and community ties. And a lot of that literature actually has come from countries like Canada and Australia, and work with by and with Indigenous populations who are seeing their land change rapidly before their eyes. There's also a lot of interest in the idea that simply knowing about or anticipating the problem of climate change can induce adverse mental health reactions. And in psychological terms, vicarious experience is one aspect of this. So vicarious experience refers to exposure through someone else's experience. For example, vicarious trauma can occur among first responders, medical service providers, or friends and family members of someone who's directly experienced a traumatic event. And there's really a very small, although sort of growing body of empirical evidence on this at the moment, but this idea of vicarious exposure, and also this idea of sort of anticipated exposure, is one that's of great interest. And we are hearing, for example, about frustration and sort of emotional and cognitive reactions to government and corporate inaction on climate change. So, for example, there was a large study among 10,000 youth that was published in Lancet Planetary Health last year that showed that that 10,000 youth globally were really experiencing some serious emotional responses due to government inaction on climate change. And there are other studies ongoing showing this. So certainly research growing in this area. And so most of the associations between climate change and mental health are not direct, and they're believed to operate through or become exacerbated by physical health problems and also social and environmental determinants of mental health. And that's really important to remember, because as Patrick said earlier, sometimes we separate or somehow forget the social conditions that climate change is impacting, and all of this is worsening kind of concurrently. So we really need to attend to that. I also just wanted to highlight that when we're thinking about next steps, there have been several pieces in the literature proposing that climate change may offer an actual opportunity to sort of improve mental health and well-being. And mental health and well-being may actually have positive impacts on climate change. So I was in a webinar this morning where somebody asked if we thought that using mental health and well-being as an argument could be effective for sort of pushing climate change adaptation and mitigation policy agendas. And I think this is a really interesting area to explore. So in other words, I'm curious if positive mental health and well-being could actually help us make the argument for and actually increase engagement in proactive actions to help us safeguard against future planetary health risks. And this is not something that's been examined in the literature, or that there's a lot of work sort of going on to assess, but I think it's an interesting idea. And looking at sort of how to promote collective action using by supporting mental health and well-being is an area that I'm interested in exploring. So I'll move on and just tell you a bit about this Delphi study that we did on mental health and psychosocial support and climate crisis research priorities. So this is mental health and psychosocial support is a long term that we often condense to MHPSS. So if you see that, that's what we're referring to. And this term really comes from some guidance that was developed in 2007 for emergency settings. So for humanitarian settings, talking about the range of supports that actually could be implemented to support mental health and well-being. And I'll just say that this study was a sort of collaboration between, myself at McGill and the MHPSS Collaborative, which is a unit within Save the Children Denmark. And so just to kind of talk about that collaboration a little bit, the MHPSS Collaborative hosts a working group on mental health and psychosocial support and climate and ecological crisis research. And this working group aims to fill research gaps in this area by fostering partnerships, generating innovative, collaborative, and participatory research, and sharing knowledge within and across sectors. So it's really an interesting group because it consists of academics, practitioners, and policymakers, and hopefully soon some funders, with representatives from a variety of organizations and institutions. So it's a bit of a different perspective. It's not really a purely academic group. And this study was really born out of a recognition within this group that there was a lack of understanding and consensus of research priorities that were specifically focused on intervention, on mental health and psychosocial support in the context of the climate crisis. So there have been other studies looking at research priorities related to climate change and mental health globally, but there seemed to be this lack of sort of study on research priorities for intervention purposes. And so since this is an area of interest that's rapidly growing, and although an expanding body of research is being conducted in the general field of climate change and mental health, very few studies have been conducted on interventions, and very few studies have been conducted on interventions or mental health and psychosocial support in low and middle income countries specifically, or in humanitarian settings. And so we really felt that this was a key gap, especially when speaking with some of our practitioner colleagues who may already be doing what we would consider as climate change and MHPSS work, but not recognizing it as so, because we just don't know how to call it or what we should be looking at. And there also remains a lack of practically oriented research evidence that can be used to support the needs of practitioners and policymakers in order to advance this area. So the overall goal of this study was really to understand priorities for climate crisis and mental health and psychosocial support intervention research by drawing on the expertise of those that were designing and implementing programs, mental health and psychosocial support programs in particular, and also those designing policies and to a lesser extent, research studies. We also wanted to be sure to include those who are living and or working in areas heavily impacted by climate change. And our research study was designed to respond to two questions. The first was how to define the parameters and terminology related to the field of mental health and psychosocial support and climate crisis research. And the second was to identify the most pressing research questions or data evidence needs to support action on mental health and psychosocial support in the context of the climate crisis. And so we used a modified Delphi process. A Delphi process is a research method for gathering consensus among experts to support decision-making. And Delphi studies are often used to examine less explored topics and to identify and prioritize research gaps, which is exactly what we were trying to do. It was modified because we were doing it with a very small budget on a very quick time scale. So this study was completed in less than 6 months and for a pretty small budget, but I think it was a good start to kind of help advance this area. And so we recruited a group of experts with demonstrated interest, engagement, and or expertise in mental health and psychosocial support and the climate crisis. And they completed 2 online surveys that were administered using Qualtrics between September and November 2021. To participate, they had to be over the age of 18, and they had to be either professionally affiliated with an organization or institution working in humanitarian or development policy or practice, have research experience on the climate crisis and MHPSS, or have had direct personal experience working in areas impacted by the climate crisis, living and working, I should say, in areas impacted by the climate crisis. So those were sort of the three options. And the 2 surveys, as were described here. So the first survey really focused on identifying research priorities and describing them and describing this kind of area of research. So we asked, for example, in the context of the climate crisis, what does mental health and psychosocial support research mean to you? This was kind of the first STEM question, and we did some thematic analysis of the responses of that question. And then we also asked, what are the most pressing research questions or data evidence needs to support action on mental health and psychosocial support in the context of the climate crisis? And we asked people to provide at least three priorities that they thought we should focus on. In the second survey, we were really focused on agreement and ranking of the priorities that we had sort of synthesized from the first survey. And so this second survey was developed using the final list of research priorities and an initial version of a concept map that we developed for this area of research from the survey 1 data. And participants were asked to indicate their agreement with each of the identified research priorities on a Likert scale from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. For each priority, participants could also indicate how they would modify the priority, if at all. And this is where the Delphi process could have continued. Unfortunately, we didn't have the scope to do additional surveys beyond that. So we kind of had to just take these modifications and report them. We weren't able to actually modify again each of the priorities and return them and then do another round. But I'll talk to you in a moment about the results and agreement despite that limitation. We also modified the concept map between the 2 surveys, and then we asked similarly for participants to describe any further modifications that they would like to see in the concept map in the second survey. And so, as I mentioned, to be eligible to participate in the study, people had to be nominated based on the inclusion criteria that I mentioned by a colleague who identified them as having demonstrated interest, experience, and or expertise in climate crisis and mental health and psychosocial support work. And we use snowball sampling to identify prospective participants through professional networks of this research working group that I mentioned, and other colleagues that were working in the area of mental health and psychosocial support in the climate crisis. So there are a number of interagency networks that we relied on for this process, and a number of large NGOs and INGOs to help kind of help us recruit for this. Information about this study was, of course, shared through professional mailing lists and other listservs of humanitarian and development organizations, as I said. And I won't go into detail here. Sorry, I'm just trying to change. There we go. So in terms of who actually ended up participating in the survey, we had 91 participants overall. Just over half were identified as men. And the average age was about 39 years. Most were based, or just over half were based in the African WHO region. And participants largely worked for humanitarian and/or development organizations, which is what we had hoped for, given our recruitment strategy. More than half were actually working in programming or practice, so not specifically in research. And almost 70% were working in mental health and psychosocial support in terms of sector distribution. The majority were also working with populations living in settings directly affected by the climate crisis, and those populations were mostly based in the African WHO region. So out of the 24 research priorities that we identified, consensus was actually obtained for 20, which means that we obtained a rating of agree among 75% or more of the sample for 20 of those priorities. And in terms of the breakdown of these priorities, 5 were categorized under sort of understanding needs and context. So in other words, assessing population needs and how climate change intersects with mental health and well-being in order to help us prepare for programming. 11 of the priorities were categorized under designing and implementing interventions. So you can see these thematic categories in this snapshot here, and not all of them are listed. But this category was the designing and implementing interventions category was really focused on understanding how to adapt, design, adapt, and implement interventions in the specific context of the climate crisis. And there were 3 priorities that were categorized under evaluating interventions. So examining how best to evaluate mental health and psychosocial support and climate crisis focused interventions, including the selection and measurement of indicators and outcomes. And I'll show you the top 8 research priorities that were identified according to participant ranking. And for each of these, there was consensus among 75% or more of the sample. So the first priority was asking, what are the direct and indirect impacts of climate change on mental health and psychosocial well-being, and how are these impacts related? And again, this is a question that would help inform future programming. It really focused on how different mental health and well-being needs could arise based on social, cultural, and economic consequences from direct and indirect climate impacts, such as loss of livelihoods, increased food insecurity, and forced migration. The second priority was asking how climate change affects the mental health and psychosocial well-being of different populations, and a wide range of populations were identified as relevant by participants. And these included frontline communities, children and young people, migrants, people with disabilities, lower income populations, the elderly, people already experiencing crises such as armed conflict, people living with pre-existing mental health conditions, and people facing discrimination, and people with intersectional identities. And this priority was focused on how climate change and mental health affects well-being and how impacts differ across these populations. There was a real emphasis on focusing on populations who are experiencing the worst impacts. And that's something that's not currently being done. The third priority was, what are different perceptions and understandings of the climate crisis across cultures and contexts? And this research priority was really focused on exploring how the climate crisis itself is being perceived. So focusing on that perception. Priority number 4 was, how are different populations adapting to and coping with the climate crisis? Again, mentioning a lot of the specific populations that I described for priority number 2. And And this priority would be looking at research that's documenting coping mechanisms, adaptive behaviors that different populations are already employing in the face of the climate crisis. So, there has been this traditional approach of just coming in and intervening from the outside, which is widely recognized now as inappropriate. But this priority really was emphasizing the need to understand what's already being done and what's already being done well. And of course, this includes understanding how climate change perceptions actually influence motivations to adapt and cope with the climate crisis at the individual, but also at population and systems levels. And so that's sort of embedded there. The fifth priority was focused on how mental health and well-being contribute to engagement in environmental protection, climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation efforts. And so this priority was looking at whether individual or community mental health and well-being contributes to engagement, that idea that I presented to you earlier, engagement in adaptation or mitigation responses, and whether outcomes of research in this area could be used to design interventions that actually increase individual and community participation in climate crisis responses. Priority number 6 was looking at how we can address mental health and psychosocial well-being concerns related to the climate crisis. So this is really an intervention-focused priority at individual, family, and community levels. And participants indicated that research on mental health and psychosocial well-being in the context of the climate crisis shouldn't just focus on establishing what mental health and well-being needs are, but also how people can be supported at multiple levels to cope with the adverse impacts. Priority 7 was looking at how we can promote positive mental health and psychosocial well-being. And so this one was looking at identifying strategies to promote positive rather than reduce adverse mental health impacts, to promote positive mental health and well-being as a way of preventing further on downstream adverse impacts related to the climate crisis and improving engagement in climate crisis related activities. And priority number 8 was looking at best practices to support mental health and well-being of different populations in the context of the climate crisis. And again, many of those populations I described previously, but participants were interested in learning about what best practices for mental health and psychosocial support programming are, and how those can be integrated into guidance, both existing and new guidance focused on the climate crisis. And so this is just a picture of the concept map that I described. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, and I welcome you all to take a look at this paper. It should be out on May 9th when the Intervention Journal puts out their special issue on climate crisis and MHPSS. But I just want to emphasize that these areas of inquiry that I mentioned, understanding needs to support programming, designing, adapting, implementing interventions, and then evaluating interventions, are, alongside some key methodologies and paradigms, are all captured here, and they align with existing guidance on research and programming and program cycles in humanitarian settings. There is value in research designed to examine how climate crisis responses could be integrated into existing mental health and psychosocial support programming, but also how mental health and psychosocial well-being shape the implementation of climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And our study highlighted the need to really center populations at all stages of this research on mental health and psychosocial support in the context of the climate crisis, and the need to understand multiple levels of impact, which is not something that's always done. There was also an emphasis here on action-oriented and participatory methodologies, as well as using climate justice and intersectional frameworks. So I think in the interest of time, I'll just wrap up here. Hopefully I've kind of convinced you through this that evidence is emerging of substantial impacts on the climate crisis on mental health and well-being. And through this particular study, we identified research priorities for demonstrating for looking at what kinds of responses might be most appropriate and might be most effective. We also need to understand the needs of populations experiencing climate crisis related impacts. So some of this has been shown in the disaster mental health literature, but much more is needed, particularly in humanitarian and very low resource settings. And this is required to inform context and population specific programs. And then practically focused research using a wide range of methodologies is needed to better inform how to address needs of heavily climate change affected populations, and to ensure that these populations are really at the center of responses moving forward. And so this is just the end of the description of the Delphi study. I don't think I'm going to conclude overall because I want to make sure we have about 10 minutes for discussion. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jura, for this very relevant and very interesting information. So I will leave the floor now to our participants, which I'm part of, and to see if there is any question at this time to be asked to Jura. Si vous avez bon, non pas que je suis un traducteur expérimenté, mais vous pouvez toujours poser la question en français si vous préférez, et puis je tenterai la meilleure traduction, mais je pense que Jura a tout à fait les compétences linguistiques pour comprendre la question également. Compétences linguistiques francophones, bien sûr.
Au moins. Yes, happy to take questions in French. I'll respond in English.
Patricia, n'hésite pas, hein, si tu vois une petite main, là pour le moment, j'en vois pas. S'il n'y a pas encore de questions, j'aurai une ou deux questions ou sujets de discussion qu'on ne devra pas terminer aujourd'hui parce que je pense que c'est difficile, mais non, il n'y a toujours pas de questions. Ok, mais je vais y aller. Je tente une question. Jura, tu as parlé d'inaction. Maybe I can ask. Sorry, I will ask it in English. You talked about government inaction. You talked about the need of collective action. You mainly talk about adaptation, maybe a little less about mitigation. So atténuation, because we know that generally, if you agree, there are two kinds of big categories of action, which is either both mitigation to try to limit as much as we can global warming, climate change through policies and practice to reduce fossil fuel combustion, fossil fuel use and exploitation, which are probably the main step to be done. At this level, I would like to use what you said and to think of us as researchers who are researching and working in institutions in Canada. I don't know if you already in your early career, maybe no time to do it, but have you ever thought of how do you think at our level we can engage and promote the participation of our own institutions, academic institutions? That is one thing. And the other, I know that you teach. I teach also. I teach mainly bachelor and master students, and I teach about climate change. To teach about climate change is not easy because you can spend hours and days to talk about crisis and terrible things that will happen, that is already happening, like flooding and fire in Canada and heat waves too. But still, we have to provide some kind of hope. And I think the hope is to be involved and to do something. So to go back to the first part of the discussion, what do you think about us as researchers who are reading, teaching, researching on climate change and its potential very serious effects? What would you think of our own practice in the context of our institutions?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Patrick. And I do think, regardless of what our specific area of work is, I do think it's really important that we become advocates within our areas of expertise. So, for example, I think professional societies are a real opportunity. That's not getting at your question about our own institutions, but any professional societies that we are part of, really ensuring that climate change is coming up as part of the agenda for any health outcome. It could be a mental health in my case, but something else for others, and just taking an active role in bringing that forward and ensuring that within this society there's movement and interest. And we're great at forming committees, so committees kind of looking at these types of things. That's one area, and that's something that I've engaged with a few professional societies on, like the Society for Prevention Research, for example, is looking at this now, and also the International Society on Traumatic Stress Studies, which is another one that I engage with. I think within institutions, and actually this has come up recently in Montreal, both for UDM and McGill, divestment campaigns are really important and helpful, and faculty certainly have a role to play in promoting those and supporting student action on pushing for divestment, but also looking at our own sort of retirement portfolios and contributions and things. That's quite important. And I think holding our institutions accountable and making sure that it's not just lip service to this issue, but that really the way that we're planning to support faculty and students is meaningful. I think on the teaching side, you raised a really important issue. It's hard, and it can be really depressing and cause serious anxiety, I think, among students to just repeatedly get into what is really some pretty grim messaging from the evidence about climate change and the future. And I don't have a perfect solution to that. I think it's important to be honest and to provide that information, and that's our duty as academics and as teachers. But I know in my own teaching on climate change and mental health, I do try to focus, first of all, on sort of the two sides. So some of the positive or mental health promotion, we could say, aspects of the literature and of my work. But I also provide students with kind of a list of resources and try to take care as we're developing and engaging in assignments to make sure that they're kind of doing okay with the material. I've also designed assignments that kind of force them, as you said, Patrick, to engage. So to think about, like, what can we do to think through project proposals or small grant applications that they could actually potentially submit to do something, whether within research or whether within sort of a practice or programming framework. And so that is the main assignment for the course that I still teach at Hopkins, just getting them to kind of think through a pitch, and that can be quite nice. And then the last thing I think is to engage with each other, because that social support is really critical for learning and then also for engaging with this difficult material. Yeah.
Thank you, Jura. I will certainly engage in the future, as we said, around the coffee to talk about those things. Is there any Natasha, Louise, Isabelle, Lubne? Est-ce que vous êtes Vanessa? Ou bien Patricia? Avez-vous une question ou un commentaire ou juste une idée, une préoccupation à partager? Non, je pense que peut-être qu'on va toutes et tous réfléchir à tout cela. S'il n'y a pas de questions pour le moment, je suppose, Justin, Jura, qu'on pourra toujours communiquer avec toi par courriel peut-être. L'adresse ne doit pas être très compliquée à trouver. je suppose. Et puis, si jamais, voilà, Natasha, no question for me, but thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Jura.
Thank you, Natasha. Yes, please get in touch with me over email. And yeah, happy to continue the discussion and find ways to collaborate on this. And look forward to hearing from you and hopefully meeting some of you in person at some point.
Important topic. Thank you, Lubna. OK. Patricia, veux-tu en parler?
Je voudrais juste dire que la prochaine webconférence du CReSP aura lieu la semaine prochaine, le 5 mai, avec Lara Gauthier et des collègues des organismes communautaires à propos du bien-être des intervenants communautaires pendant la pandémie de COVID-19. Nous aurons aussi d'autres conférences organisées au sein du CReSP. Je vous invite à aller sur le site web pour apprendre plus sur une conférence avec les Transnut et avec Myriagon qui seront bientôt aussi en début mai.
Merci beaucoup, Patricia. Merci, thanks a lot, Jura. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde pour votre participation and we keep in touch.
Merci tout le monde.